There's another thing that a lot of people don't really understand about the natural history of Highlands and how special it is. It's always been so diverse and so special with birds and animals and plants. It was a big drawing card to early scientists and early naturalists back from all the way back for 100 years or more, back into the 1800s. All of the very famous naturalists and biologists came to Highlands to not only to study at the biological station, but long before that. And we can go way back in time. The very first one that we know that came here was a Frenchman by the name of André Michaux. And he came up right across Highlands. His journal shows, he kept a really good journal, a daily journal, shows very clearly that he came right across Highlands. And he describes all of the plants and natural beauty of the Highlands Plateau. And of course, he was a botanist and he appreciated the plants. And of course, we had some of the early ornithologists, people who would come to Highlands to see birds they couldn't find anyplace else. The cliffs of Highlands, the Wildcat Cliffs and Whiteside Mountain and Satula Mountain were very well known for ravens, for example. The ravens were very prolific here in the Highlands area, whereas they weren't anyplace else. And so ornithologists and bird lovers would come here from all over the country to look for ravens, and also to at all the different warblers and different animals, different birds of that type. And of course, the biological station became very famous for its studies of the salamanders and reptiles and many of these smaller animals. We had several really well-known ecologists that came here to study not only the primeval forest, but all of the landscape around the area. So that it's been a kind of a mecca because of the natural landscape for centuries, or at least for a century and a half, mostly since Highlands was established. One of the conservation movements that we got into, my wife Glenda and I have worked on these together. She's been really the sort of the power behind the throne on this. I had the credentials being a retired professor, and of course she's a botanist and she's got plenty of credentials of her own, but together we worked on trying to reduce what we would call the exploitation of the national forest here. And Highlands is surrounded by the national forest, and we're dependent on them depending on the forest for much of the natural beauty and also just the natural landscape here. And when 30 years ago it was being clear cut, the big push in those days was for timber operations, and the forest industry was sort of running the national forest at that time, making all the political decisions. And so Glenda and I got into this program of we started an organization here in Highlands called the chapter of the Western North Carolina Alliance here in Highlands, to work with the local ranger in the national forest here to see if we could stop the clear cutting that was going on and do some more sensitive types of logging. We understood there had to be some timber cut because Congress required it. It was one of the laws of the land, but it could preserve as much of it as possible by using more sensitive types of logging, and we managed to pull that off. I'd kind of like to point out that when I was growing up as kids, we used to go out and spend a lot of time in the woods, and so did all of our friends and all of the other folks that came up to Highlands for the summer, or even all the local folks that live here in Highlands year-round. I mean, one of the main reasons we were here was to get out into the natural environment that was out there. Family picnics were all the time, scheduled on every sunny day practically, and lots of family hikes and lots of trips to waterfalls and to the tops of mountains, and just to get out in the woods, just to hike from one place to another. You know, there weren't any roads, so we actually had to walk. Walking from town out to Naiad Falls, which is right just below Mirror Lake along the Colasaja River, just before it dumps into Lake Sequoia there. That was a very popular hike back in those days. But of course, and of course, all of the natural forest around Highlands. I like to think of Highlands like as kind of a hole in a donut. The Highlands Plateau was originally an undeveloped area up here, and then when the National Forest came into existence in the 1920s, a lot of the old land was bought up by the National Forest, and then it was the part inside this donut was not sold to the National Forest, but all the stuff around it was. So that we have Highlands itself was surrounded by National Forest, and then we're still in the hole in the donut, which is privately owned. It's all privately owned here. Now the National Forests are doing a good job of preserving the landscape, preserving the forest, and allowing the biological diversity to build up. And there's still a lot of it out there. However, the hole in the donut is filling up with developments and houses and all, whereas 30, 40, 50 years ago, the hole in the donut itself was just as wild as the land outside of this in the National Forest. There was many, many places you could walk to and hike to, lots of little waterfalls and secret places to go, and people would do that, but no more. You can't even hike to the top of Black Rock Mountain anymore, and that was a very nice, popular hike in the just as recently as 30 years ago. And of course, Satula is still available. There is we do have public access to the top of Satula, and of course, but now the Whiteside Mountain is overcrowded because a lot of the other places you can't get to anymore because they're privately owned,